A boy helps a millionaire who was attacked by a wild boar. The next day an Audi appears in front of his house. The city roared outside William's penthouse. A symphony of car horns and muffled voices filtered through the towering glass windows. Sunlight reflected off the glass skyscrapers, casting sharp streaks of light onto the polished wood floor of his living room. The space was impeccable, an architect's masterpiece of modernity. But amidst the sleek furniture and curated art pieces, the clutter of William's desk betrayed another story. Stacks of documents teetered on the edge. A coffee cup stained with rings sat, forgotten, and his laptop screen blinked with unanswered emails. William leaned back in his leather chair, his tie slightly loosened, his gaze unfocused on the sprawling cityscape below. The world stretched endlessly beyond him, yet in this moment, it felt stifling, claustrophobic. The phone on his desk buzzed again, its persistent vibration a reminder of the deals, meetings, and obligations waiting for him. He glanced at it, the name Martin lighting up the screen. A colleague, or more precisely, another link in the endless chain of demands. He didn't pick up. William ran a hand through his disheveled dark hair, sighing. His reflection stared back at him from the window. Sharp suit, weary eyes. Wealth had given him much. The view, the status, the enviable address. But these days it all felt hollow, like chasing shadows on a foggy day. A knock broke through his thoughts. "Mr. Everett?" It was Olivia, his assistant, standing at the doorway, clipboard in hand. She hesitated before continuing. "Your 2 p.m. meeting is confirmed, and the board expects you at the presentation tomorrow morning. Should I move anything to lighten your schedule today?" William's lips pressed into a thin line. "No, leave it." Her polite mask didn't falter, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of hesitation, as if she wanted to say more, but knew better. "Understood. Let me know if you need anything else." As she left, William stared at the now closed door, her heels clicking faintly down the hallway. It wasn't her fault. It wasn't anyone's fault, but the mounting weight on his shoulders felt unbearable. He stood abruptly, walking to the balcony. The air hit him like a slap, dry and warm, carrying the faint tang of exhaust and asphalt. The city sprawled below him, pulsating with energy. It was alive, thriving. Everything William had worked for. Yet the noise of it all seemed to press harder against his temples, a relentless pressure he couldn't escape. He closed his eyes and let the breeze wash over his face. How long had it been since I really breathed? The thought lingered, heavy and unwelcome. The sound of his phone vibrating again snapped him back. He turned sharply, snatched the device, and silenced it with a flick of his thumb. Then, almost as an act of rebellion, he turned it off entirely. A decision formed in his mind, not carefully weighed or meticulously planned, as most of his actions usually were. No, this was different, impulsive. He'd leave, just for the weekend. His footsteps echoed through the pristine apartment as he moved purposefully to his closet. The steel-grey suits stared back at him like silent judges, but he ignored them, grabbing a plain shirt, jeans, and a jacket. His movements were quick, almost hurried, as though afraid he'd change his mind if he lingered. The garage was cool and dimly lit, the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead. His car, a sleek black sedan, waited patiently as he climbed in, the leather seat hugging him like a familiar embrace. The engine purred to life, but instead of soothing him, the sound felt like a challenge, a reminder of everything he was leaving behind, even if just for a few days. William guided the car out of the underground lot and onto the bustling streets. The skyscrapers loomed above, their glass facades reflecting a brilliant afternoon sun. Pedestrians darted across crosswalks, coffee cups in hand, while taxis honked impatiently at slow drivers. The rhythm of the city was unyielding, relentless. The highway stretched out before him like an unspooling thread, leading away from the chaos. As the cityscape began to fade in the rearview mirror, replaced by rolling hills and sparse clusters of trees, William felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Relief, maybe even hope. The road ahead curved gently, winding its way toward the countryside. William adjusted his grip on the wheel, the hum of the tires on the asphalt a steady companion. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to relax, his shoulders easing away from his ears. Unknowingly, he had set himself on a path that would take him far beyond the tranquility he sought. A path that would lead him deep into the unknown, where peace was only the beginning. The sun dipped lower in the sky as he drove on, casting long shadows across the road. Somewhere ahead, the countryside waited, quiet and unassuming, as though holding its breath for what was to come. The car slowed to a halt on a narrow gravel road, the sound of loose stones crunching beneath the tires breaking the silence. William killed the engine and stepped out, his leather loafers pressing into the soft earth. The world here seemed entirely different from the city he had just left behind. Vast, quiet, untamed. A dense forest stood ahead, the treetops swaying gently in the breeze. Beyond them, hills rolled softly into the horizon, their grassy slopes painted gold by the late afternoon sun. William inhaled deeply. The air was cool and clean, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp soil. For the first time in what felt like years, his chest didn't feel so tight. He grabbed a light jacket from the car, slinging it over one shoulder as he ventured toward the forest's edge. The sound of the city, honking horns, shouting pedestrians, was nothing but a distant memory now. Instead, the world here was alive with subtler melodies, the chatter of birds, the rustle of leaves, the steady hum of cicadas. William's steps were slow, measured. Each stride felt deliberate, as though he were wading into a pool of still water. The ground beneath him shifted from gravel to soft earth, his shoes leaving faint impressions in the damp soil. He followed no particular path, letting his feet guide him deeper into the wilderness. The forest welcomed him with its quiet majesty. Shafts of sunlight pierced through the canopy, illuminating patches of moss-covered ground. Ferns curled lazily at the base of towering oaks, their fronds shimmering faintly in the light. The further he walked, the more he felt his mind ease, his shoulders relax. How long had it been since I did something like this? He wondered. There had always been another deal to close, another meeting to attend, another goal to chase. He stopped near a fallen log, running his fingers over its rough bark. The texture felt grounding, real. Birds flitted between the branches above, their feathers streaks of blue and yellow against the green. William smiled faintly, something deep within him stirring. Not joy exactly, but the beginning of something lighter, quieter. But the peace was fleeting. A faint shift in the air caught his attention. The breeze had died, and the forest, so alive moments ago, seemed to hold its breath. The chatter of birds stilled, leaving behind a silence that pressed against his ears. William glanced upward. The once clear sky had darkened, grey clouds rolling in like waves over the horizon. A single droplet of rain struck his cheek, cold and sharp, followed by another. Within seconds, the drizzle became a downpour, the steady patter of rain filling the stillness. William pulled his jacket over his head, but it did little to shield him. The rain was relentless, soaking through his clothes, making the earth slick and treacherous beneath his feet. He turned back the way he came, or at least he thought he did. The dense undergrowth looked unfamiliar now, each tree a mirror of the last. "Damn it," he muttered, wiping water from his face. His breaths quickened as the forest closed in around him. Pushing forward, he stumbled over a root, catching himself against a tree. His polished shoes slipped in the mud, and the cold seeped into his skin. A twinge of panic began to rise in his chest, but he forced it down. "Stay calm. It's just rain. You'll find the road." The sound came suddenly, shattering the rhythm of the rain. A low, guttural grunt, followed by the unmistakable rustling of undergrowth. William froze. His eyes darted toward the noise, searching the dense thicket for its source. Then he saw it. A wild boar, its massive frame emerging from the shadows. The creature's coarse, mud-streaked hide glistened in the rain, and its tusks curved menacingly upward. Small, dark eyes locked onto William, unblinking, calculating. William's heart thundered in his chest. He took a cautious step back, his hands raised instinctively. "Easy," he whispered, though the word felt absurd in the face of such raw power. The boar let out a sharp snort, pawing at the ground. The muscles in its shoulders rippled as it lowered its head. William didn't need to be a wildlife expert to understand what was coming next. He turned and ran. The forest blurred around him as he stumbled through the rain, branches clawing at his arms, his breath ragged. Behind him, the boar's heavy footfalls thundered, each step shaking the earth. Mud sprayed as William slipped again, landing hard on his side. Pain shot through his hip, but there was no time to dwell on it. He scrambled to his feet, his pulse a deafening roar in his ears. The sound of the boar grew louder, closer. William glanced over his shoulder, his eyes wide with terror. And then, in the chaos of rain and mud, he saw something else. A figure, small but steady, darting through the trees toward him. The figure emerged with startling speed, weaving through the rain-soaked trees like a thread pulled taut. William barely registered the movement before the boy came into full view, a wiry frame draped in a patched jacket, dark hair plastered to his forehead by the downpour. "Get down!" the boy yelled, his voice cutting through the chaos like a whip. William, frozen with fear and exhaustion, dropped to his knees as the boy darted past him, gripping a sturdy branch in both hands. The boar was almost upon them, its hooves churning up mud as it charged, tusks gleaming like dull blades in the dim light. The boy didn't falter. With a practiced swing, he struck the ground in front of the animal, sending up a spray of dirt and leaves. He shouted again, his voice fierce, guttural, an unexpected sound from someone so young. The boar hesitated, its momentum faltering. "Go on!" the boy barked, slamming the stick against a nearby tree. The sharp crack reverberated through the forest. For a moment, the boar seemed to consider its options, its beady eyes flicking between the boy and its fallen prey. Then, with a final snort of frustration, it turned and bolted into the undergrowth, its bulky form disappearing into the rain. William exhaled shakily, his limbs trembling as the adrenaline coursing through him began to fade. The boy, still gripping his makeshift weapon, turned and crouched beside him. "You okay?" the boy asked, his tone brisk but not unkind. William tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. He managed a nod, though he wasn't sure if it was true. His body ached, his clothes clung to him like a second skin, and his breathing was shallow. The boy didn't wait for a proper answer. He glanced at William's mud-streaked frame, his eyes narrowing as he noticed the awkward angle of William's leg. "You're hurt," he said, matter-of-factly, already moving to examine the injury. William flinched as the boy's small but steady hands prodded gently at his leg. "It's not broken," the boy muttered, almost to himself. "But you're not walking out of here like that." "Who?" William's voice was hoarse, barely audible above the rain. He cleared his throat. "Who are you?" "Dennis," the boy replied, not looking up. He pulled a length of cord from his pocket and began fashioning a crude brace with 2 sticks he'd pulled from the ground. "You shouldn't be out here. This forest isn't forgiving." "I noticed," William muttered weakly, wincing as Dennis secured the makeshift splint around his leg. Dennis didn't reply, his focus entirely on the task at hand. His movements were quick and deliberate, his expression calm despite the storm raging around them. He worked with the ease of someone who had done this many times before. When he finished, Dennis stood and wiped his hands on his jacket. "We need to get you out of the rain," he said, his voice firm. "Can you stand?" William hesitated, but reached for Dennis's outstretched hand. His attempt to rise ended in a sharp intake of breath as pain shot through his leg. Dennis caught him before he could fall, his grip surprisingly strong. "Thought so," Dennis said with a shake of his head. He crouched again, turning his back to William. "Climb on. I'll carry you." William blinked, momentarily stunned. "You're kidding," he said, though there was no humor in his tone. "Do I look like I'm kidding?" Dennis shot back, glancing over his shoulder. His face, though young, was set with determination. "We're wasting time." William hesitated, pride warring with practicality. But the rain was relentless, and his body was nearing its limit. With a grimace, he wrapped his arms around Dennis's shoulders and allowed himself to be hoisted up. The boy staggered slightly under the weight, but adjusted quickly, securing William's arms across his chest. "Hold tight," he instructed, his voice steady despite the strain. Dennis began to move, his steps sure and deliberate, even on the slippery ground. The forest around them seemed darker now, the rain casting everything in shades of grey. William felt every jolt, every uneven step, but he kept silent, his exhaustion too great to argue. "Why were you out here?" Dennis asked after a while, breaking the heavy silence. His voice was calm, conversational, as though they weren't trudging through a storm. "Needed quiet," William murmured. His words felt heavy, weighted with fatigue. "Got more than I bargained for." Dennis huffed a quiet laugh, though there was no malice in it. "Yeah, well, this place doesn't do quiet for long." William didn't reply. His head rested against Dennis's shoulder, his eyes half closed. He felt the boy's steady breath, the rhythm of his footsteps, and for the first time in hours, a faint glimmer of hope. Ahead, the faint outline of a house appeared through the trees, its windows glowing warmly against the storm. Dennis's pace quickened. "We're almost there," he said, more to himself than to William. William let out a soft, shaky breath. He didn't know where there was, but in that moment, it didn't matter. The storm continued to rage around them, but for the first time since he'd stepped into the forest, William felt a fragile sense of safety. Dennis adjusted his grip on William's arms as the rain lashed against his back. Each step felt heavier than the last, the muddy forest floor threatening to pull him down. The weight of the man on his shoulders was significant, but Dennis pushed on, his determination unyielding. "You're stronger than you look," William murmured, his voice faint. Dennis didn't respond immediately, focusing instead on navigating the slippery trail. "I've carried heavier," he said, after a moment. The words clipped. Ahead, the trail narrowed, its edges swallowed by tangled roots and rising puddles. Dennis shifted his stance to keep his footing steady. The storm roared above, branches swaying violently, and the distant growl of thunder made the air feel charged. "Stay awake," Dennis instructed, glancing over his shoulder at William. "You don't want to pass out in this weather." William's response was a weak groan, but Dennis took it as acknowledgement. The forest was both friend and foe to Dennis. He knew its trails and hidden clearings, the signs of its moods and dangers. But tonight, under the relentless storm, it felt different, unpredictable, hostile. Each step forward was a battle, the wind pushing against him, as if the forest itself was testing his resolve. His mind wandered briefly to his father, a man who had walked these very trails countless times. The memories came unbidden. His father's steady hands showing him how to tie knots, the firm but patient voice explaining which plants were safe and which could kill. "The forest gives and takes, Dennis," his father had once said, "but it's always fair if you respect it." Dennis's grip tightened on William's arms. "I'm not letting him die here," he thought, squaring his shoulders. "Where are we going?" William's slurred question pulled Dennis back to the present. "Home," Dennis said simply. "Not far now." William tried to lift his head, but quickly let it fall back against Dennis's shoulder. "You live out here? In the middle of this?" Dennis huffed, a faint smile tugging at his lips despite the situation. "Not in the middle, no. Close enough, though." He shifted his footing as the path dipped sharply, the mud sucking at his boots. His legs burned with exertion, and his breath came in short bursts. But he didn't stop. Just a little farther, he told himself, though the weight pressing against his back seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. The faint glow of the house grew brighter as they approached. Dennis could see the outline of the small wooden structure now, its roof low and slanted under the weight of the storm. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, barely visible against the dark sky. "There it is," Dennis said, more to himself than to William. The boy quickened his pace, his feet slipping slightly as he reached the clearing. The house stood modestly, its windows flickering with warm light, a stark contrast to the cold chaos of the forest. As they drew closer, the door burst open, and a woman stepped out, a shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders. Her face was etched with worry, her eyes scanning the dark before landing on Dennis. "Dennis!" she called, her voice trembling. "What happened?" "Help me with him," Dennis said, his tone firm but strained. He didn't stop until he was at the porch, lowering William carefully onto the wooden steps. Brenda knelt beside them, her hands fluttering briefly before settling on William's face to check for a fever. "Who is this?" she asked, her gaze darting to Dennis. "He got lost in the forest," Dennis explained, wiping rain from his brow. "Hurt his leg. Boar almost got him." Brenda's expression darkened. "Inside, now." Together, they hauled William into the small house, laying him on a patched-up couch near the fireplace. The warmth of the room enveloped them immediately, the crackling fire a welcome reprieve from the storm. Brenda moved quickly, grabbing a blanket to drape over William and a small basin of water to clean his wounds. Her hands were sure and practiced, her worry evident but contained. Dennis stood nearby, his chest rising and falling heavily. The exhaustion was catching up to him now that the immediate danger had passed. He leaned against the wall, watching as his mother worked. "Dennis," Brenda said, without looking up, her voice softening slightly. "Are you hurt?" Dennis shook his head. "I'm fine." Brenda glanced at him, her sharp eyes scanning his face, before returning to William. "You shouldn't have been out in this weather." "I was looking for mushrooms," Dennis replied, his tone defensive but quiet. Brenda didn't argue, her focus remaining on William. The man stirred slightly, his eyelids fluttering as he struggled to stay conscious. "Thank you," William whispered, his voice barely audible. His eyes flicked toward Dennis, then Brenda. "Thank you both." Brenda pressed a cloth to his forehead, her movements gentle. "Save your strength," she said. "You'll need it." Dennis crossed his arms, his gaze fixed on William's pale face. Despite his fatigue, a flicker of pride warmed his chest. He'd done it. He'd gotten the man here safely. Outside, the storm raged on, but within the small house, there was a fragile sense of calm, a haven carved out of the chaos. Dennis exhaled slowly, his mind already planning the next steps. Tomorrow, he thought, we figure out what to do next. The room was filled with the warmth of the fire, its glow dancing along the wooden walls. The scent of herbal remedies and damp earth lingered, a reminder of the storm outside. Brenda moved with quiet urgency, a woman used to solving problems with her own 2 hands. She wrung out a cloth in the basin of warm water and began cleaning the mud from William's face. His features, sharp and weary, softened under her touch. Her hands were steady, but her eyes flicked occasionally toward Dennis, assessing his posture, his soaked clothes, his silence. "Go change, Dennis," Brenda said firmly, not pausing her work. "You'll catch your death if you stand there dripping all night." Dennis hesitated, his gaze darting to William. "I've got him," Brenda interrupted, her voice brooking no argument. "Now go." Dennis sighed and disappeared into the adjoining room, his wet boots leaving faint marks on the worn wooden floor. Brenda returned her attention to William, wiping the grime from his forehead and cheeks. His breathing was shallow but even. She inspected the makeshift splint on his leg and muttered under her breath, impressed despite herself. Dennis had tied it well, firm enough to stabilize, but not enough to cut circulation. "You did a good job out there, Dad," she murmured softly, her mind drifting back to the man who had taught her everything about first aid and resilience. Her father, Adam, had always said, "People are stronger than they think, but sometimes they just need someone to remind them." Brenda shook her head, pulling herself back to the present. She gently lifted William's leg and propped it on a folded blanket. The man stirred, his eyelids fluttering. "You're awake," she said simply, meeting his bleary gaze. William blinked, his lips parting as though to speak, but no words came. Brenda reached for a small mug of warm broth on the side table. "Drink this, slowly." She helped him sit up just enough to sip the broth, her hand steady against his shoulder. He coughed lightly, his throat too dry for comfort, but the warmth seemed to revive him slightly. "Thank you," he rasped, his voice rough but earnest. Brenda nodded once. "You're lucky Dennis found you when he did." "Boars aren't known for mercy." William let out a weak chuckle, though it ended in a wince. "I'll remember that." Brenda's expression softened, though her movements remained brisk as she tucked the blanket more securely around him. "You should rest," she said. "Storm won't last forever. We'll figure out what to do in the morning." As William lay back against the cushions, his gaze wandered around the room. It was small, practical, but welcoming in its simplicity. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of dried herbs and mismatched books. A small table by the window held an old lantern and a neatly folded quilt. "You live here," he said, his voice still faint. Brenda glanced at him briefly before folding the now dirty cloth. "Yes. Why?" "It's peaceful," William murmured, his words slow, almost hesitant. "Different from what I'm used to." Her hands stilled for a moment, and she regarded him with a curious expression. "What is it you're used to?" William exhaled slowly, his head turning toward the window. Outside, the rain still fell in steady sheets, the storm's fury beginning to wane. "Noise," he said finally. "Phones ringing. People talking over each other. Deadlines. Chaos." He laughed softly, bitterly. "The kind of life you think you want until you're drowning in it." Brenda didn't respond immediately. She finished folding the cloth and placed it neatly by the basin. "Peace isn't something you find," she said after a moment. "It's something you choose to keep." William looked at her, his brow furrowed. "You sound like my father." Brenda smiled faintly, though the gesture didn't quite reach her eyes. "My dad was the same way. Always knew the right thing to say, whether you wanted to hear it or not." She stepped to the shelf and grabbed a jar of ointment, her fingers brushing over the neatly labeled jars as she worked. "He taught me Everything I know, she continued, her voice quieter now. How to treat a fever, tie a proper knot, stand up to things bigger than me. William watched her intently, though he remained silent. He had this way of seeing people, Brenda went on, as if speaking more to herself than to William. He believed everyone deserved a second chance, no matter how lost they seemed. She paused, placing the jar on the table. He would have liked you, I think. William blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift. Me? Brenda met his gaze, her eyes calm but piercing. You've got that look, she said simply, like someone who's searching for something. William opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. Searching. The word settled heavily in his chest, as though it had been waiting to be acknowledged. Before he could say more, Brenda stood and reached for the lantern. Why were you in the forest, Mr. William, he interjected. William Everett. She nodded once, acknowledging the name. So, Mr. Everett, what were you doing out there? William hesitated, the firelight casting flickering shadows on his face. He glanced toward the window, the storm's reflection shimmering faintly in the glass. Trying to find quiet, he said finally, his voice low. Brenda raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, waiting. William sighed, his head sinking back into the cushions. Guess I didn't do such a great job at it. Her silence was thoughtful, not judgmental. Quiet's tricky, she said at last, her tone as steady as her hands. Sometimes, it's not about where you go. It's about what you leave behind. The room fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire and the rhythmic patter of rain. Brenda moved to tidy the basin, leaving William alone with his thoughts. The storm had passed by the time dinner was ready, leaving a damp stillness in its wake. The air carried the fresh scent of wet soil and pine, blending with the aroma of warm bread and a vegetable stew simmering on the stove. Brenda ladled portions into mismatched bowls and set them on the table, her movements brisk but careful. Dennis sat quietly, his damp hair falling across his forehead as he tore pieces from a crusty loaf of bread. William, propped up in a sturdy wooden chair with a pillow behind his back, watched the boy with curiosity. Despite his obvious exhaustion, Dennis's demeanor remained composed, his sharp eyes flicking between William and his mother. You're lucky she cooks, Dennis said suddenly, breaking the quiet. He glanced at William, his tone dry but not unfriendly. I'd have handed you crackers and called it a day. Dennis, Brenda said, the corner of her mouth twitching in what might have been a restrained smile. William chuckled weakly, the sound rusty in his throat. I'll take my chances with her cooking then, he replied. Brenda set a steaming bowl in front of William, nodding toward it. Eat, she said. You'll need the energy. The three of them ate in silence for a while, the soft clinking of spoons against bowls mingling with the distant hum of crickets outside. William savored the warmth of the stew, its simple flavors soothing in a way he hadn't expected. It's good, he said after a moment, his voice quiet. Thank you, Brenda replied, her tone as unassuming as the rest of the house. William leaned back slightly, the firelight casting flickering shadows across his face. It's peaceful here, he said, his words slow, deliberate. I didn't think places like this still existed. Brenda raised an eyebrow, but it was Dennis who spoke. Why'd you come out here anyway? William hesitated, his spoon hovering over the bowl. He glanced at Brenda, then back at Dennis, as if weighing how much to reveal. Finally, he sighed. I needed quiet, he said, his voice low. Life in the city. It's loud, chaotic, always something pulling at you. I thought, if I could just get away for a while. You'd find it, Brenda finished, her voice soft but steady. William nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Yeah, something like that. Dennis tilted his head, studying William with a curiosity that felt older than his years. And? Did you? William chuckled bitterly, shaking his head. Not exactly. Turns out, I'm not great at finding quiet. I just bring the noise with me. Brenda's gaze lingered on him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Quiet isn't about running away, she said, echoing her earlier sentiment. It's about letting go. William looked at her, something unspoken passing between them. He opened his mouth to respond, but the faint sound of shuffling outside the window caught his attention. His brow furrowed, and he turned slightly, his body tensing. What is it? Brenda asked, following his gaze. Stay here, William said quietly, his tone sharper than before. He pushed himself up from the chair, wincing as his leg protested. William, I'll be fine, he interrupted, limping toward the door. Outside, the cool night air wrapped around him like a damp blanket. He stepped onto the porch, his eyes scanning the shadows. The faint rustle came again, and he turned toward the source. A figure crouched near the window. Hey, William called, his voice firm. The figure froze, then bolted toward the tree line. William caught a glimpse of a man, tall, lanky, with a distinctive slouch, before he disappeared into the dark. What was that? If you're listening to this part of the story, leave a comment saying latte as a greeting to us. And now let's continue the story, Brenda asked, appearing in the doorway. William turned back to her, his jaw tight. Someone watching, he said. He ran off when I saw him. Brenda's expression darkened, and she glanced toward the forest. Bruce, she muttered, more to herself than to William. Bruce? William asked, his tone laced with concern. She sighed, crossing her arms. A neighbor, if you can call him that. He has a habit of lurking where he shouldn't. William frowned. Does he bother you often? Brenda didn't answer immediately. He's harmless, she said finally, though the tension in her shoulders suggested otherwise. William didn't push, but his gaze lingered on the tree line. He made a mental note to keep an eye out, just in case. Back inside, the tension seemed to settle slightly, though the earlier warmth had dulled. Brenda busied herself clearing the table, her movements quick and precise. Dennis's father left shortly after I got pregnant, she said abruptly, her back to William. The words were spoken plainly, without ceremony, as if they were a fact of the house itself. William blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift. We came back here, Brenda continued, stacking the bowls in the sink. My father helped me raise Dennis, but he passed a few years ago. Since then, it's just been us. The quiet that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. William nodded slowly, his gaze falling to the fire. Your father sounds like a good man, he said softly. Brenda paused, her hand resting on the edge of the counter. He was, she said, the best. Outside, the crickets continued their quiet symphony, filling the spaces where words didn't reach. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, casting soft golden hues across Brenda's small living room. William sat on the patched-up couch, his injured leg resting on a stool. Outside, the low rumble of an approaching vehicle broke the calm. Olivia had arrived with the rescue team. Dennis was the first to notice, peering out the window. Your ride's here, he said, his tone neutral, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of something deeper. Brenda opened the door as Olivia stepped out of the Audi, her polished heels crunching softly against the gravel. Behind her, two paramedics unloaded a stretcher, their movements efficient. Olivia's gaze swept the modest home, her professional mask briefly faltering at the sight of William in such an unfamiliar setting. Mr. Everett, Olivia called, relief evident in her voice. We were worried about you. William nodded, standing slowly with Dennis's help. The boy's grip was steady, but William could feel the quiet reluctance in the way he lingered, holding on just a moment longer than necessary. At the door, William turned to Brenda and Dennis. He pulled a checkbook from his jacket and scribbled a figure before extending it toward Brenda. "For everything you've done," he said. "Please." Brenda glanced at the check, her lips tightening. "We don't need your money, Mr. Everett," she said firmly. "Just take care of yourself." Dennis gave a small nod of agreement, his expression unreadable. William hesitated, then folded the check and slipped it back into his pocket. He looked at them both, searching for words, but none seemed enough. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice heavy with sincerity. As the paramedics helped him into the vehicle, William caught Dennis's gaze one last time. The boy raised a hand in a brief quiet farewell. The Audi pulled away, leaving behind a trail of dust and the lingering sense of something unfinished. William sat in his penthouse apartment, staring at the skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The view was breathtaking. Sprawling city lights flickered like distant stars, the hum of life pulsing below. But tonight, it felt cold, sterile. The leather chair he lounged in, perfectly contoured to his frame, provided no comfort. His desk was organized with surgical precision, the absence of clutter only amplifying the emptiness he felt. A week ago, this space had been his haven, a fortress built on success. Now, it seemed like a gilded cage. He sipped his scotch, the burn doing little to dull his thoughts. His mind kept wandering to that small house on the edge of the forest, to Brenda's calm voice, to the determined look in Dennis's eyes. He hadn't been able to shake it since he'd returned, hadn't been able to focus on the spreadsheets and emails demanding his attention. Olivia's voice cut through the stillness, soft yet efficient as always. She stood near the door, a tablet in hand. "Mr. Everett, I've compiled the information you requested." William turned, gesturing for her to sit. She approached cautiously, her sharp eyes scanning his face. He knew she could see it. The distraction, the weariness. She was too professional to comment, but he could feel her curiosity. "Go on," he said, leaning forward slightly. Olivia tapped her tablet, bringing up a file. "The woman, Brenda Shaw, lives in the house you described, along with her son, Dennis. Records indicate she's lived there for over a decade. No significant debts, no criminal record." William nodded slowly. "And her family?" Olivia hesitated for a moment, as though weighing her next words. "Her father, Adam Shaw, passed away about 5 years ago. He was well known in the local community, a carpenter, but also active in charity work. It seems he was instrumental in helping new residents settle in the area." William felt a sharp pang in his chest. He hadn't heard the name in years, but the memories came flooding back with startling clarity. Adam. Memories flooded back, vivid despite the years. Adam had been the foreman at a small warehouse when William had first arrived in Texas as a struggling entrepreneur. The man had given William his first break, offering not just advice, but quiet, unspoken acts of kindness. A meal when William couldn't afford one, a place to sleep when money ran out. "I owe that man everything," William muttered under his breath, his voice thick with emotion. "Sir?" Olivia prompted, her brow furrowed. William shook his head, waving a hand dismissively. "Nothing. Go on." Olivia continued, her voice measured. "Brenda returned to live with Adam shortly after her son was born. From what I've gathered, she's been raising Dennis alone since her father's passing. They've managed, but their income seems limited to odd jobs and a small garden they maintain." William leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words settling over him. Adam had helped him build his life, and now Adam's daughter was struggling to maintain hers. It didn't sit right. Olivia cleared her throat gently. "Will there be anything else, sir?" William's gaze shifted to her, his expression sharper now, more focused. "No, that's all for now." She nodded and left the room quietly, the soft click of the door closing behind her. William turned back to the window, gripping the tumbler in his hand. The city lights blurred as his thoughts raced. Adam's kindness had been a turning point in his life, one he had never truly repaid. And now, his daughter and grandson were living on the edge of survival, quietly enduring hardships they didn't deserve. He set the glass down with a decisive clink, his jaw tightening. He wouldn't let it stand. His mind turned to Brenda's stoic resilience, to Dennis's unyielding determination. They hadn't asked for anything. They hadn't even seemed to want his gratitude, but that didn't mean they didn't need help. William stood, his movements brisk as he crossed the room to his desk. He flipped open his laptop, pulling up documents and contacts he hadn't touched in years. If Brenda and Dennis wouldn't accept help directly, he would find a way to give it without strings attached. His phone buzzed, a reminder of a morning meeting, but he silenced it without hesitation. Work could wait. This was more important. As he drafted a plan, his determination grew. He would go back, not just to thank them, but to make sure they had everything they needed. Brenda's home, her livelihood, Dennis's future. He would ensure they were secure. The faint hum of the city buzzed in the background, but William barely noticed. His focus was singular now, his purpose clear. The drive back to Brenda and Dennis's house was quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound accompanying William's thoughts. His car rolled over the uneven dirt road, the trees thinning as the modest home came into view. This time, the weather was bright and sunlight spilled over the clearing, casting soft shadows under the pines. William stepped out, his gaze settling on the house. It looked the same, small, functional, with an air of resilience that matched its occupants. The trunk of his car popped open with a soft click, revealing neatly packed boxes. He exhaled slowly, reminding himself to tread carefully. Dennis was the first to notice him. The boy emerged from the side of the house, a trowel in one hand and dirt smudged across his cheek. His expression shifted from surprise to cautious curiosity. "You're back," Dennis said, his tone neutral, but tinged with something faintly resembling relief. "I told you I'd visit," William replied with a faint smile. "Is your mum around?" Dennis nodded, jerking his thumb toward the open door. "Inside." William lifted one of the boxes from the trunk, balancing it carefully as he walked toward the house. Dennis hesitated before following, his sharp eyes darting to the package. Inside, Brenda was bent over a table, chopping vegetables with precise, efficient movements. She looked up as they entered, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Everett," she said, straightening. "I wasn't expecting you so soon." "William," he corrected gently, setting the box down on the table. "I thought I'd drop by to thank you properly. Again." Brenda's gaze flicked to the box, then back to William. "You didn't need to." "I know," William said, his voice steady. "But I wanted to." She hesitated, her hand still resting on the knife. "What's in the box?" "Just a few things," William said casually, opening it to reveal an assortment of items, a bag of coffee beans, books, and tools. His movements were deliberate, careful not to overwhelm. Brenda frowned slightly, her gaze softening as she took in the thoughtful selection. "This is—" She trailed off, her tone uncertain. "It's nothing extravagant," William said quickly. "Just a little something to make things easier." Dennis leaned over to peer into the box, his curiosity breaking through his guarded demeanor. "Tools?" he asked, his voice lifting slightly. "I figured they might come in handy," William said, glancing at him with a small smile. Brenda's expression remained cautious, but the tension in her shoulders eased slightly. "Thank you," she said after a moment, her voice quieter now. As they unpacked the box together, the atmosphere softened. Brenda's initial wariness gave way to gratitude, though she still held herself with the quiet dignity William had come to admire. When they were done, William leaned back against the counter, his hands resting on the edge. "I wanted to ask you something," he said carefully. Brenda looked at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "It's about your father," William continued, his tone gentle. "Adam Shaw." Brenda froze for a moment, her knife hovering over a carrot. Then, slowly, she set it down and turned to face him fully. "You knew my father?" William nodded, his expression solemn. "I did. Years ago. When I first moved to Texas, I was struggling. He helped me in ways I can't even begin to explain." He paused, searching for the right words. "I wouldn't be where I am today if it weren't for him. He gave me a chance when no one else would." Brenda's eyes softened, and she folded her arms across her chest, leaning slightly against the counter. "That sounds like him," she said quietly. Dennis glanced between them, his curiosity evident but unspoken. "He never talked much about himself," William continued, "but I could tell he was someone who carried a lot on his shoulders, someone who gave more than he ever took." Brenda smiled faintly, a flicker of pride in her expression. "He was. He taught me everything I know about hard work, about kindness, and he loved Dennis more than anything." Dennis shifted slightly, his gaze falling to the floor. "I want to repay some of what he gave me," William said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I know I can't ever truly repay him, but I want to help you, both of you." Brenda straightened, her guarded demeanor returning. "We don't need charity, William," she said firmly. "It's not charity," William replied, holding her gaze. "It's gratitude. And it's what your father would have done for me if the situation were reversed." Brenda hesitated, her hands gripping the counter behind her. "I'm not asking to change your life," William said, "just to make sure Dennis has every opportunity he deserves. I'd like to help with his education, schools, resources, whatever he needs." Dennis's head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise. Brenda's jaw tightened, and she looked away, her internal conflict written across her face. "You don't have to decide now," William said gently. "Just think about it." The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the distant chirping of birds outside. Brenda finally nodded, though her expression remained guarded. "I'll think about it," she said quietly. William exhaled, relief flooding through him. "That's all I ask." Outside, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. Despite the uncertainty that lingered, something unspoken passed between them, a connection that felt as steady and enduring as the land beneath their feet. William's visits became a quiet rhythm in the weeks that followed. He no longer arrived with boxes of supplies, nor did he push his offer about Dennis's education. Instead, he came empty-handed but full of intention, slowly building trust with Brenda and Dennis in ways that felt genuine, unhurried. He often found Brenda in the garden, her hands deep in the soil, the sun highlighting the streaks of grey in her dark hair. She would glance up when he arrived, her expression softening just slightly each time, though she rarely stopped her work. "Back again," she teased one afternoon, brushing dirt from her hands. "You're not getting rid of me that easily," William replied with a faint smile, settling onto a wooden bench nearby. Inside the house, Dennis's admiration for William grew in quiet moments. The boy often lingered near William as he talked about his work in the city, or the opportunities he'd seen for people who had access to education and resources. Dennis's curiosity was unguarded now, his sharp mind soaking in everything William shared. "Do you really think I could go to a school like that?" Dennis asked one day, his tone hesitant but filled with hope. William looked at him, his expression sincere. "I don't just think it, I know it." "You're smart, Dennis. Smarter than I was at your age." Dennis grinned, a rare, genuine smile that lit up his face. Brenda, overhearing from the kitchen, paused mid-chop, her heart tightening at the sight of her son's excitement. But with that excitement came Brenda's fears. She voiced them one evening as she and William sat on the porch, the horizon painted with the colors of dusk. Dennis had gone to bed, leaving the two adults alone with the quiet sounds of the countryside. "I don't want him to forget where he comes from," Brenda said suddenly, breaking a comfortable silence. William turned to her, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" She sighed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You're offering him the world, William, and I'm grateful, truly. But I've seen what happens to people who leave places like this. They lose their roots, their values. I don't want Dennis to grow up thinking he's too good for the life we've built here." William nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "Brenda, I understand. I've seen it too. But I think you're underestimating Dennis. He's grounded because of you, because of the life you've given him. That won't change just because he learns more or sees more of the world." Her jaw tightened, her gaze fixed on the darkening sky. "And if it does?" she asked quietly. William hesitated, then said, "Then it'll be up to you and me to remind him, to guide him." Brenda's eyes flicked to him, searching his face for any sign of insincerity. She found none. "What you're offering," she began, her voice steadier now. "It's more than I ever thought possible for him. But I need to know that it comes without expectations, without strings." "It does," William said firmly. "I owe your father that much. And honestly, I owe Dennis too, for saving my life." The tension between them eased slightly, and Brenda leaned back in her chair, her shoulders relaxing. "I'll agree," she said finally, her tone measured. "But on one condition." William raised an eyebrow, waiting. "Dennis has to remember that whatever he learns, whatever he becomes, it's his responsibility to give back, to help others the way you're helping him now." William's expression softened, and he nodded. "That's a condition I can live with." Brenda's lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile, and for the first time since William had made his offer, she looked at him with something close to trust. Inside, Dennis stirred in his bed, unaware of the future being shaped for him just outside. The night deepened, the stars scattering across the sky like quiet witnesses to the moment. And for the first time in a long time, William felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The city skyline unfolded in the distance, glittering against the pale blue of early morning. Dennis sat in the passenger seat of William's car, his hands fidgeting with the strap of his backpack. The boy's wide eyes took in the towering buildings, the endless streets, and the sheer energy of the city, so different from the quiet, familiar rhythms of home. William glanced at him briefly, a reassuring smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You nervous?" Dennis shrugged, though his tightened grip on the strap betrayed him. "A little," he admitted. "That's normal," William said, his tone easy. "First days are always the hardest, but you'll get through it." The prestigious school loomed ahead, its sprawling campus surrounded by iron gates and manicured lawns. Dennis stared at it, his awe laced with apprehension. As they pulled to a stop, William turned to him. "Just remember, you belong here, Dennis. Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." Dennis nodded, swallowing hard. "Thanks," he said softly before stepping out of the car. The first week was a whirlwind of new faces, unfamiliar routines, and moments that left Dennis questioning everything. The other students wore their confidence like armor, their easy laughter and polished manners, making him feel like an outsider. But then there were the small victories. A math problem solved correctly in class, a kind comment from a teacher the day he worked up the courage to join a conversation during lunch. Each success chipped away at his doubts, though the adjustment was far from smooth. William remained a steady presence. Every evening he called to check in, his voice calm and encouraging. When Dennis confessed his struggles with fitting in, William listened without judgment. "I felt the same way when I first started in the city," William shared one evening, his tone reflective. "Everyone seemed like they had it all figured out and I was just lost. But you'll find your place, Dennis. Trust me." Brenda visited for the first time a month later. She stepped onto the campus, her practical shoes clicking softly against the polished floors of the school's main hall. The walls were lined with student achievements, photos of smiling teenagers holding awards and certificates. Dennis greeted her with a grin, his excitement barely contained. "Mom, you've got to see the science lab," he said, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward his favorite part of the school. Brenda let herself be led, her expression a mix of pride and something quieter, more hesitant. She watched as Dennis pointed out the equipment, his enthusiasm spilling over in rapid explanations of his latest project. "He's doing well," William said softly, appearing beside her. Brenda nodded, her gaze fixed on Dennis. "He's happy," she said, her voice tinged with both relief and uncertainty. "But it's strange, seeing him like this, like he's already growing away from me." William's expression grew serious. "He's not growing away, Brenda. He's growing up. And everything he's doing, it's because of the foundation you gave him." Brenda turned to him, her eyes softening. "I hope you're right. Dennis's growth was evident, not just in his confidence, but in the way he began to see the world." One evening, as he and William sat on the balcony of William's apartment overlooking the city, Dennis spoke up, his voice thoughtful. "You know," he began, his gaze distant, "I used to think people like me didn't belong in places like this. Like it was meant for someone else." William looked at him, waiting. "But now," Dennis continued, his tone stronger, "I think it's not about belonging. It's about making space for others, for people who feel like I did." William smiled, his pride evident. "That's a good way to look at it." Dennis turned to him, his expression earnest. "One day I want to go back, to help the people in our town, like you're helping me now." William nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. "I think you'd make your mum and your grandfather very proud." Dennis smiled faintly, his gaze returning to the glittering lights of the city. "I hope so." Brenda's visits continued sporadically, and each time she noticed subtle changes in her son. His posture was straighter, his words more confident, yet his kindness remained unchanged. One evening, as she prepared to leave after a weekend visit, Dennis hugged her tightly. "Thanks for letting me come here, Mum," he said quietly. Brenda held him for a moment longer than usual, her voice soft but firm. "Just don't forget where you came from, Dennis." "I won't," he promised. As she stepped into William's car for the ride back to her house, Brenda glanced at William. "You were right," she said simply. "About what?" She gave a small, knowing smile. "About him staying grounded. He's still my Dennis." William chuckled, the warmth in her words settling over him like a balm. That night, Dennis sat at his desk, a notebook open in front of him. His handwriting was neat but purposeful as he sketched out ideas for a future he could barely imagine a year ago. He paused, looking out the window at the city lights. Somewhere in his heart, he carried the rhythm of his hometown, the rustling of the forest, the chirping of crickets, and the lessons instilled by his mother and grandfather. William's sprawling city mansion, once an echo of isolation, now hummed with quiet life. Brenda's warm presence filled the kitchen as she brewed coffee, the aroma mingling with the scent of blooming flowers from the garden terrace. Dennis's laughter rang faintly from the backyard, where he was surrounded by a small group of children from a nearby community center. William stood by the window, watching the scene unfold. The boy had once carried him from the woods, had grown into a confident, compassionate young man. Dennis knelt under the shade of a tree, explaining something to the children with the patience of a natural teacher. His gestures were animated, his smile infectious. Brenda joined William by the window, a steaming mug in her hands. She followed his gaze, her expression softening as she watched her son. "He's becoming someone I never imagined," she said quietly, her voice tinged with awe. William smiled. "He's becoming someone who will change lives." Brenda sipped her coffee, her fingers tightening around the mug. "I worry sometimes," she admitted, "that he'll give too much of himself the way my father did." William turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "If he does, it's because he's seen the best of it. He's seen what generosity can build." He paused, his voice softening. "Your father gave me a chance when I had nothing. You gave me back a sense of purpose. And now Dennis, he's carrying that forward." Brenda looked at William, her eyes shimmering. "We've all given something, William. But you've given him the world." He shook his head, a gentle laugh escaping him. "He's made it his own. All I did was show him the door." The two of them fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that no longer needed words. The sound of children's laughter drifted in through the open window, mingling with the rustle of trees in the distance. The afternoons often found Dennis at William's desk, now cluttered with textbooks and notebooks. William took on the role of mentor, guiding Dennis not just in academics, but in the art of resilience and leadership. "Being smart isn't enough," William told him one evening as they worked through a problem set. "It's about using what you know to lift others up. That's where true success lies." Dennis nodded, his gaze steady. "Like you've done for me." William leaned back in his chair, his smile tinged with pride. "Like your mother and grandfather did for me," he corrected. These lessons shaped Dennis, who began to see the world through a lens of opportunity, not just for himself, but for others. His plans for the future expanded, his dreams no longer limited by what seemed possible. One weekend, Brenda joined them in the city to discuss a new project. Together, the three of them began planning charitable initiatives focused on rural communities. "We'll start with the school," Dennis said eagerly, spreading out a map on the dining table. "It needs better equipment, more teachers, maybe even a library." Brenda looked at him, her pride evident but tempered by her practicality. "It's a good idea, Dennis, but where will the money come from?" William tapped the edge of the map, his expression thoughtful. "I know people who'd support this. They just need to see the value in it, the potential for real change." Brenda tilted her head, her smile faint. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not," William admitted, his tone light. "But neither is walking into a forest during a storm and coming out alive. We've done harder things." Dennis laughed, his confidence infectious. "We'll make it happen, Mum. You'll see." The final scene unfolded on the porch of William's mansion, where he and Brenda sat side by side, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The city lights began to twinkle, blending with the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. In the distance, Dennis was under the tree again, the children gathered around him. He was sketching something in the dirt, their eager faces leaning in to watch. Brenda sighed softly, a sound of contentment. This is what my father would have wanted," she said. William nodded, his gaze never leaving Dennis. It's what he set in motion, and what you've carried forward. She turned to him, her smile warm. You're part of it, now, you know. Part of us. William's chest tightened with emotion. For so long, he had sought peace in solitude, in the idea of escape. But here, surrounded by the quiet hum of life and the promise of something greater, he realized he had found it. In this family, in their shared purpose. The woods in the distance swayed gently in the wind, their rhythm echoing the steady beat of something unshakable. William smiled, his heart full. I wouldn't want it any other way. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values yet entertaining. See you there.